There's a peculiar kind of person who moves through life like a shadow, not out of timidity or fear, but out of a deep, almost spiritual resistance to being seen. In a world that worships visibility, that measures worth in followers and views, that treats obscurity as failure and fame as success, these individuals quietly reject the entire paradigm. They're not trying to become visible and failing. They're actively choosing invisibility in a culture addicted to the spotlight. This rejection isn't about social anxiety, though that might be present. It's something deeper, almost soul level. A fundamental incompatibility between who they are and what visibility demands. So why do some souls reject the spotlight in a world addicted to visibility? What is it about their essential nature that makes the spotlight feel like violence rather than validation? And what can Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who understood that the soul has its own requirements that often contradict social demands, teach us about why certain people must remain in shadow to preserve their integrity? To understand this, we need to start with Jung's profound concept of the soul and its relationship to visibility. Jung used the term soul, particularly in connection with the anima, to describe the inner dimension of personality that carries depth, meaning, and connection to the unconscious. The soul, in Jung's framework, is fundamentally interior. It lives in depths, in darkness, in hidden dimensions that can't be adequately represented on surfaces. The soul speaks in symbols, in dreams, in quiet intuitions, not in public performances. Here's what's crucial. For certain individuals, their soul is not just an aspect of their personality, but their primary identity. They live from their soul. They experience reality through their soul. They are soul-identified in ways that most people aren't, and the soul simply cannot survive in the spotlight. The spotlight is surface, performance, reduction to what can be seen and judged. The soul is depth, authenticity, irreducible complexity. When you put soul under spotlight, it withers, retreats, dies. People who reject the spotlight in a world addicted to visibility are often those for whom the soul is primary, and they understand instinctively that visibility would require abandoning their soul-centered existence for ego-centered performance that would feel like death. Jung himself was deeply soul-identified, and his writings consistently prioritize soul preservation over social success or public recognition. There's also something profound about what Jung called the introvert's orientation and why it's fundamentally incompatible with spotlight culture. Jung defined introversion not as shyness, but as a fundamental orientation of consciousness toward the inner subjective world. For deep introverts, reality itself is primarily internal. The external world is real, but it's secondary, experienced through the lens of internal response and reflection. The spotlight demands exactly the opposite orientation. It requires directing all your energy outward, toward audience, toward external impression, toward surface appearance. It requires living primarily in external reality, constantly aware of how you appear, how you're being perceived, what impression you're making. For soul-level introverts, this external orientation feels like being turned inside out, like being forced to exist in a dimension that isn't their natural habitat. They don't just dislike the spotlight, they experience it as existential violence, as being forced into a mode of existence that contradicts their fundamental nature. People who reject the spotlight are often deep introverts for whom the spotlight isn't just uncomfortable, but actually impossible to inhabit without destroying who they fundamentally are. Jung would validate this completely, understanding that introversion isn't a preference that can be overcome, but a constitutional orientation that must be honored. There's also something crucial about what Jung called the persona and why certain souls refuse to create the substantial persona that visibility requires. The persona is the social mask we all wear to some degree. But there's enormous variation in how much persona different people need or can tolerate. Some people can develop robust personas that feel reasonably comfortable, that allow them to function socially without too much inner conflict. But others, particularly those who are deeply authentic or soul-identified, experience even moderate persona performance as profoundly false and draining. The spotlight requires a highly developed, robust persona. You can't be in the spotlight as your authentic self. You must be in the spotlight as your performed self, your public image, your carefully constructed persona. This persona must be consistent, appealing, relatable, understandable to mass audiences. People who reject the spotlight often have souls that simply cannot generate or maintain the substantial persona that visibility requires. Their authentic self is too complex, too contradictory, too private, too nuanced to be reduced to a performable persona. And they're unwilling or unable to perform a persona that doesn't genuinely represent who they are. Their rejection of the spotlight is rejection of the persona performance that spotlight demands, choosing authentic invisibility over false visibility. Let's also consider what Jung understood about psychological energy and the energetic cost of visibility. Jung recognized that psychic energy is finite and must be carefully allocated. For introverts, Jung explained, energy is depleted by external interaction and restored by solitude. The spotlight is the ultimate energy drain for introverts. It's constant external interaction, constant performance, constant expenditure of energy outward, with no opportunity for the solitary restoration that introverts require. When you're in the spotlight, even if only metaphorically through high social media visibility, you're in a state of constant energetic depletion. Every view, every comment, every reaction requires energy to process and manage. People who reject the spotlight have often recognized, consciously or unconsciously, that visibility would drain them to the point of psychological collapse. They're not being weak or antisocial. They're engaging in crucial self-protection, preserving their finite energy for activities and relationships that genuinely nourish them, rather than depleting them. Jung himself was extremely careful about his public exposure, understanding that excessive visibility would drain the energy he needed for his inner work and genuine creative production. There's also something profound about what Jung called individuation, and why the spotlight directly undermines it. Individuation, remember, is the process of becoming your authentic, unique self, rather than conforming to collective expectations. But the spotlight is fundamentally collective. When you're visible to masses of people, you inevitably become subject to collective pressure. The collective has expectations, preferences, demands. It wants you to be understandable, relatable, consistent with familiar categories. It punishes uniqueness that threatens or confuses. Genuine individuation requires separation from collective influence, space to discover what's uniquely yours versus what you've absorbed from others. People who reject the spotlight are often those most committed to genuine individuation. They understand that visibility would subject them to collective pressure that would prevent them from discovering and living their authentic, unique nature. The spotlight forces conformity even when it appears to celebrate uniqueness. What looks like individual expression in the spotlight is actually performance of individuality that fits collective expectations about what unique looks like. True uniqueness, the kind that genuine individuation produces, is often too strange, too subtle, too complex to be successfully performed for mass audiences. People who reject the spotlight are protecting their individuation process from collective forces that would shape and normalize them, choosing authentic obscurity over performed uniqueness that isn't really unique at all. Jung would see this rejection as psychologically sophisticated, understanding that real individuation often requires withdrawal from collective visibility. Jung also understood something crucial about what he called the self and its relationship to recognition. The self in Jung's psychology is the organizing center of the total personality, the deep source of meaning and wholeness that transcends the ego. The ego wants recognition, validation, social position. But the self has entirely different concerns: wholeness, authenticity, alignment with your deepest nature, connection with something larger than personal identity. People who reject the spotlight have often shifted from ego-centeredness to self-centeredness. They're no longer motivated by what the ego wants, the recognition and validation that the spotlight provides. They're motivated by what the self seeks. And the self often seeks invisibility, because visibility forces you back into ego functioning, into concern with social position and others' perceptions, rather than genuine wholeness and authentic being. Their rejection of the spotlight reflects psychological maturity, the shift from ego concerns to self-concerns that Jung considered the primary task of the second half of life. The spotlight serves the ego, but often at the cost of the self. Choosing invisibility is often choosing the self over the ego, depth over surface, wholeness over fragmented performance. Jung spent much of his later life withdrawn from public life precisely because he had made this shift towards self-centeredness that no longer needed or wanted visibility. There's also something significant about what Jung called the collective shadow, and how the spotlight makes you its target. Jung spoke not just of individual shadow, but of collective shadow, the darkness that entire cultures refuse to acknowledge. This collective shadow needs targets, visible individuals onto whom it can project its unintegrated darkness. When you're in the spotlight, you become a potential target for collective shadow projection. The more visible you are, the more you attract projection of collective envy, resentment, hatred, and unintegrated darkness. People who reject the spotlight often have unconscious awareness of this danger. They sense that visibility would make them targets for collective shadow attacks that could be genuinely traumatic. This isn't paranoia, it's accurate perception of a real dynamic. Highly visible people do attract enormous amounts of projected collective shadow, and managing this projection is psychologically damaging. The rejection of spotlight is often unconscious self-protection from becoming a screen for collective darkness that you'd have no way to defend against or escape. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the sacred and profane, and how the spotlight profanes what should remain sacred. Jung recognized that certain experiences, insights, and aspects of being have sacred quality that requires protection from profanation. The sacred cannot survive in profane contexts without being stripped of its sacred nature. The spotlight is fundamentally profane. It reduces everything to entertainment, to content, to material for casual consumption. Sacred experiences become anecdotes. Profound insights become sound bites. Deep, authentic being becomes performed personality. People who reject the spotlight are often protecting the sacred dimensions of their experience and being from profanation. They understand that certain things lose their essential nature when exposed to the spotlight's profaning gaze. This isn't about being precious or superior. It's about recognizing that sacred and profane are genuinely different realms, and that maintaining the sacred requires keeping it separate from the profane spotlight. Jung himself experienced this tension throughout his life, struggling to share his most sacred experiences and insights, knowing that public exposure would inevitably profane them to some degree. There's also something profound about what Jung called psychological wounds and how they create legitimate spotlight aversion. Jung understood that psychological wounds profoundly shape personality and needs. Many people who reject the spotlight carry wounds around visibility, Perhaps they were shamed when visible as children. Perhaps they were exploited or used when they attracted attention. Perhaps they experienced trauma connected to being seen or exposed. These wounds create legitimate aversion to visibility that isn't neurotic, but protective. The spotlight would re-traumatize, would activate old wounds, would cause genuine psychological harm. People who reject the spotlight due to visibility wounds aren't being weak or avoidant. They're protecting themselves from re-experiencing trauma, honoring the psyche's wisdom about what can and cannot be safely tolerated. Jung would approach these wounds with deep compassion, understanding that healing doesn't necessarily mean overcoming spotlight aversion, but might mean permanently honoring the limits that wounds create. Jung also understood something about what he called vocation or calling, and how some souls are genuinely called to invisible work. Jung believed that each person has a unique purpose, work that only they can do. For some people, that calling involves visibility, public leadership, influence through recognition. But for others, the calling is to invisible work, deep thinking, inner development, creative work that doesn't seek audience, service that doesn't need recognition, wisdom that develops in obscurity. People who reject the spotlight are often living their actual calling, which requires invisibility. Their work, their purpose, their contribution happens in dimensions that spotlight would destroy. They're not failing to achieve visibility. They're succeeding at invisible work that's equally valuable but operates according to different principles. Jung would honor this calling to invisible work as he honored his own need for periods of withdrawal, understanding that not all valuable work happens in spotlight, and that forcing spotlight on those called to invisible work destroys their capacity to fulfill their actual purpose. There's also something crucial about what Jung called the relationship with death and how it shapes spotlight rejection. Jung emphasized that confronting mortality, living with awareness of death, transforms priorities and values. When you've genuinely confronted your mortality, when you understand that life is finite and precious, the spotlight often loses its appeal. You realize you don't want to spend your limited time performing for others, managing public image, dealing with the demands of visibility. You want to spend your time on what genuinely matters, authentic relationships, meaningful work, inner development, experiences that nourish your soul. People who reject the spotlight often have this mortality awareness. They've looked at death and decided that visibility isn't worth the cost, that their finite life is too precious to spend in performance, that they want to live authentically in the time they have, rather than performing for masses of people who don't actually know them. Jung's emphasis on death awareness as catalyst for authentic living would support this rejection of spotlight in favor of genuine being during the limited time we have. Let's also consider what Jung understood about archetypes and how certain souls embody the hermit or sage archetype. Jung identified universal archetypal patterns that humans embody throughout history. One powerful archetype is the hermit or sage, the wise figure who withdraws from society to pursue deeper truths. This archetype values solitude, obscurity, and inner development over social recognition. People who reject the spotlight are often unconsciously embodying this hermit-sage archetype. They're not being antisocial or afraid. They're living according to an ancient pattern of meaning that has always valued withdrawal and invisibility as paths to wisdom and authentic being. This archetypal identification gives their spotlight rejection a quality of rightness, of alignment with something larger than personal preference. They're not just choosing invisibility. They're answering an archetypal calling that has shaped wise figures throughout human history. Jung himself embodied aspects of this archetype, particularly in his later years when he withdrew from public life to focus on his inner work and writing. There's also something significant about what Jung called the anima and animus, the inner contrasexual figures, and how they affect relationship with visibility. For men, the anima is the inner feminine that carries soul, depth, and interiority. For women, the animus is the inner masculine that carries critical thinking and spiritual aspiration. People with strong anima or animus connections often reject the spotlight because visibility interferes with these crucial inner relationships. The anima and animus are shy, private figures that retreat when too much external attention is present. They speak in whispers, in dreams, in quiet moments of reflection. The spotlight's noise and demands drive these inner figures away, severing connection with the soul depth they carry. People who reject the spotlight are often protecting their relationships with these inner figures, understanding that visibility would cost them the inner companionship and guidance that matters more to them than any external recognition. Jung maintained extensive privacy around his anima experiences precisely because he understood that this inner relationship required protection from external intrusion and could not survive in spotlight conditions. Jung also understood something about what he called psychological types and the thinking-feeling axis. Thinking types are primarily concerned with logic and understanding. Feeling types are primarily concerned with values and meaning. But both types, when deeply developed, often develop spotlight aversion for different reasons. Highly developed thinking types reject the spotlight because it interferes with thinking. Deep, sustained thought requires conditions that visibility destroys: solitude, freedom from interruption, no concern with how you appear. Highly developed feeling types reject the spotlight because it violates their values. They value authenticity, genuine connection, depth of relationship, all of which the spotlight's superficiality contradicts. People who reject the spotlight are often highly developed types, either thinking or feeling, who've recognized that their primary function cannot operate properly in spotlight conditions. Their rejection isn't dysfunction, but loyalty to their actual psychological strengths and values. Jung would never suggest that developed types should force themselves into spotlight that contradicts their nature. There's also something profound about what Jung called the compensation function, and what spotlight rejection might be balancing. Jung observed that the psyche naturally compensates for one-sided conscious attitudes or cultural imbalances. In a culture that has become pathologically addicted to visibility, that treats obscurity as failure and fame as success, rejecting the spotlight serves a compensatory function. At a personal level, it might compensate for early experiences of excessive visibility or forced performance. At a cultural level, it compensates for the collective's one-sided emphasis on visibility by maintaining the opposite pole of valuable obscurity. People who reject the spotlight are often unconsciously serving this compensatory function, not just for themselves, but for the culture. They're demonstrating that another way is possible, that value doesn't require visibility, that meaningful life can happen in obscurity. This compensation is psychologically and culturally valuable, providing necessary balance against cultural pathology. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the transcendent function and how it requires distance from collective pressures. The transcendent function is the psyche's capacity to generate new understanding by holding tension between opposites without collapsing into either side. This function operates best when you have distance from collective influence, space to think and feel independently of mass opinion. The spotlight puts you in the center of collective pressure, constantly aware of others' reactions and expectations. This collective immersion prevents the transcendent function from operating. You can't generate genuinely new understanding when you're constantly responding to collective feedback. People who reject the spotlight are often maintaining the distance from collective necessary for the transcendent function to work. Their obscurity isn't emptiness, it's the condition for genuine psychological creativity, for insights that transcend collective thinking, for the kind of original understanding that mass visibility would prevent. Jung's most important insights came during periods of withdrawal from visibility, when he had the distance from collective necessary for genuinely transcendent thinking. There's also something crucial about what Jung called wholeness and how spotlight forces fragmentation. Jung believed that psychological health requires wholeness, integration of all aspects of personality, including shadow material. But the spotlight requires splitting yourself into acceptable public aspects and hidden unacceptable aspects. You must perform only the positive, hiding everything that doesn't fit the image you're presenting. This enforced splitting prevents genuine wholeness. People who reject the spotlight are often choosing wholeness over the fragmentation that visibility requires. In obscurity, they can be whole, acknowledging both light and shadow, living all aspects of their personality rather than performing only acceptable parts. This wholeness feels more essential to them than the recognition that spotlight would provide, at the cost of splitting themselves. Jung would see this choice as psychologically healthy, prioritizing integration over external validation. Jung also understood something about the religious or spiritual function and how many spiritual traditions value obscurity over visibility. Throughout religious history, the deepest spiritual development has often required withdrawal from public life. Mystics, contemplatives, serious spiritual practitioners have traditionally sought obscurity because genuine spiritual development requires conditions that visibility destroys: silence, solitude, freedom from ego inflation, protection from others' projections. People who reject the spotlight are often those for whom spiritual or religious function is primary. Their obscurity isn't avoidance of life, but dedication to spiritual life that requires different conditions than worldly success. They're following ancient wisdom traditions that have always understood that the deepest spiritual truths are found in withdrawal rather than visibility, in darkness rather than spotlight, in humble obscurity rather than celebrated fame. Jung himself had profound spiritual experiences and understood that genuine spirituality often requires protection from the profaning effects of excessive visibility and public attention. There's also something significant about what Jung called the collective and the individual, and how spotlight erases genuine individuality. Jung distinguished between the collective person, shaped entirely by social expectations and mass consciousness, and the individuated person who has discovered their unique, authentic nature. The spotlight, despite appearing to celebrate individuals, actually enforces collective conformity. To be successfully visible, you must be understandable to the masses, which means fitting into categories the collective recognizes. True individuality, the strange, subtle, complex uniqueness that genuine individuation produces, cannot be successfully spotlit because it doesn't fit collective categories. People who reject the spotlight are often protecting their genuine individuality from being forced into collective molds that visibility requires. They'd rather be authentically unknown than falsely known as something that fits collective expectations but isn't actually who they are. Let's also consider what Jung understood about projection and how the spotlight creates a hall of distorting mirrors. Jung discovered that people constantly project their own unconscious material onto others, seeing not what's actually there, but their own psychological content reflected back. When you're in the spotlight, you become a screen for millions of projections. People see in you whatever their own unconscious needs to see: hero, villain, victim, inspiration, threat. None of these projections has much to do with who you actually are. People who reject the spotlight often understand this projection dynamic and want no part of it. They don't want to be seen as projections rather than as themselves. They don't want to become characters in others' psychological dramas. They want the possibility of being genuinely known by a few, rather than being projectively misperceived by many. The spotlight guarantees misperception on a massive scale, and for certain souls, this feels worse than obscurity. Jung experienced this throughout his life, constantly misunderstood and reduced to projections, which reinforced his understanding that visibility doesn't mean being truly seen. There's also something profound about what Jung called the conjunctio and the necessary union of light and darkness. Jung believed that wholeness requires integrating opposites, including light and shadow, consciousness and unconsciousness. But the spotlight is all light, harsh illumination that eliminates shadow, forces everything into visibility, allows no darkness. This one-sided emphasis on light prevents the conjunctio, the union of opposites that creates genuine wholeness. People who reject the spotlight are often maintaining necessary relationship with darkness that wholeness requires. They understand that not everything should be illuminated, that darkness has value, that shadow is necessary, that some things develop properly only in obscurity. Their rejection of spotlight is rejection of one-sided light in favor of the balanced interplay of light and darkness that Jung considered essential for psychological and spiritual wholeness. Jung also understood something about what he called psychological defenses and when they're legitimately protective rather than pathological. Defensive patterns aren't always dysfunction. Sometimes they protect genuinely vulnerable aspects of psyche that aren't ready for exposure. Spotlight rejection might be defensive, but it might be legitimately protective defense. Perhaps you're protecting aspects of yourself that would be genuinely harmed by visibility. Perhaps you're protecting creative work that needs privacy to develop. Perhaps you're protecting psychological wounds that can't tolerate scrutiny. Perhaps you're protecting authentic self from pressures that would force you to become false. Jung would explore what the defense is protecting and whether it's still necessary, but he would never assume that defensive spotlight rejection is automatically pathological. Sometimes the psyche knows what it needs to protect, and respecting these defenses is psychological wisdom. There's also something crucial about what Jung called the relationship between consciousness and unconsciousness, and how spotlight forces everything into consciousness prematurely. Jung believed that psychological health requires proper relationship between conscious and unconscious, with material moving from unconscious to conscious at appropriate pace and timing. But the spotlight forces premature consciousness. When you're visible, you must be constantly aware, constantly conscious of how you appear, constantly monitoring and managing. There's no space for unconscious processes to unfold naturally. People who reject the spotlight are often maintaining the proper balance between consciousness and unconsciousness that psychological health requires. They allow things to remain unconscious until they're ready to emerge naturally. They don't force premature consciousness through the constant self-awareness that visibility demands. This respect for unconscious timing is psychologically sophisticated, honoring the psyche's natural rhythms rather than forcing everything into conscious performance. Finally, there's something to be said about what Jung called the work of individuation, and how it culminates in the freedom to live according to your own nature rather than social demands. The ultimate achievement of individuation, Jung believed, is the capacity to live authentically according to your unique nature, regardless of collective pressures. For some people, this means choosing spotlight if that genuinely fits their nature. But for others, it means rejecting spotlight precisely because it contradicts their nature. People who reject the spotlight in a world addicted to visibility are often demonstrating the highest achievement of individuation, the freedom to choose obscurity despite cultural pressure toward visibility, the courage to live according to their actual nature, rather than conforming to collective values about worth requiring recognition. This is psychological freedom and maturity of the highest order, transcending social conditioning to live authentically. In the end, why some souls reject the spotlight in a world addicted to visibility is multifaceted but fundamentally about preserving integrity. They're preserving soul-centered existence that spotlight would destroy. They're honoring introverted orientation that spotlight violates. They're refusing persona performance that feels false. They're protecting finite energy from visibility's drain. They're maintaining separation from collective necessary for individuation. They're serving the self rather than the ego. They're avoiding becoming targets for collective shadow. They're protecting the sacred from profanation. They're honoring visibility wounds that make spotlight genuinely dangerous. They're living invisible callings that spotlight would destroy. They're embodying hermit sage archetypes. They're maintaining relationships with anima or animus that visibility disrupts. They're following spiritual traditions that value obscurity. They're protecting genuine individuality from collective conformity. They're avoiding projections distorting effects. They're maintaining balance of light and darkness. And ultimately, they're exercising the freedom that individuation provides to live according to their authentic nature rather than collective demands. Carl Jung would not only validate this spotlight rejection, but celebrate it as psychological and spiritual maturity in an age that has forgotten that worth doesn't require visibility, that meaningful life doesn't need audience, that the deepest human experiences happen in obscurity. He would remind you that some of humanity's greatest contributions have come from those who worked in shadow, that wisdom has traditionally been found in withdrawal rather than spotlight, and that in a culture pathologically addicted to visibility, those who choose obscurity are maintaining essential truths that the culture desperately needs but has forgotten. Your rejection of the spotlight isn't failure, fear, or dysfunction. It's integrity, wisdom, and perhaps most profoundly, it's the courage to be authentically yourself in a world that relentlessly pressures you to become the performed, fragmented, false self that visibility demands. You're living according to soul rather than ego, depth rather than surface, authenticity rather than performance. And Jung would say that this is exactly what genuine psychological and spiritual maturity looks like, regardless of whether the visibility-addicted world understands or values it.